Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for September 14th, 2023. I want to begin with an announcement, which is that we are beginning to post these individual presentations from the September 9th Schiller Institute online conference. The whole conference is available at the schillerinstitute.com. Today I'm going to be posting the first three that we have up on the site, and they'll be linked in the description page so you can watch the discussion and see what we were doing and the importance of the work of the Schiller Institute in shaping the fight in the West in particular toward ending the unipolar order and establishing a new security and development architecture. Now, my presentation today is based on my angry response to listening to the BBC this morning. The BBC has been doing almost non-stop coverage of the tragedy of the flooding, which is taking place in Libya, which they are estimating may mean as many as 18 to 20,000 people have been killed. Now, typically you have the BBC reporters presenting the human interest side of this, the sorrow of the individuals, the breakdown, the wiping out of families, of villages. And what they keep coming back to is that it was a bad storm, that the dam burst, both of which are true. And then they talk about how this is a natural disaster. And then they talk about the division in Libya between East and West and how the government can't get its act together to take care of infrastructure. And they talk about the corruption in the government. And they basically say these are the causes that led to as many as 20,000 people dying. And they report that people had been telling government officials that the dams had cracks in them, but nothing was done. It wasn't repaired, and furthermore, the rescue efforts have been slow and inconsistent. Now, listening to this provides a case study of how media lying and censorship work to produce reactions to an event without understanding what's the real cause, because they never discuss the real cause, what's behind the problems in infrastructure, the division in the government, and so on. The reason is there was a regime change operation conducted by NATO forces in 2011, led by the British and the French, with Barack Obama famously saying he was leading from behind. And given recent reports about Obama's sexual orientation, maybe that has an additional context that people should consider. But the fact is that this was an operation in 2011, which has profound implications today, including the reaction, why there's such a strong reaction against the unipolar order coming from Africa. So let me just review what happened. Many of you probably remember hearing the term Arab Spring, which took place in 2011 with uprisings in several of the Arab and Middle Eastern countries. What you didn't hear at the time was that these were regime change operations sponsored by Western governments, in particular the United Kingdom and the United States. Obama and his administration referred to these as moderate rebels fighting for democracy in their countries. And in particular, you had the operation in Libya and Syria, in which the U.S. was actively involved in supporting radical Islamic forces that were involved in trying to overthrow the governments of the country. Now, this occurred after the brute force attack on Iraq that was led by George W. Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, and the neoconservative war hawks. So in 2011, you had the Arab Spring. The rebels were supported by NATO forces, and in June 2011, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant against Muammar Gaddafi, the leader of Libya. And then on October 20th, 2011, Gaddafi was murdered by the rebels who were being backed by the US, Britain, and France. Now the question is, what was Gaddafi's crime? Why was he indicted by the court? Why were the Western forces deployed to destroy his government and his country? Well, in the 1980s, Gaddafi was a supporter of terrorism. There were several events, the Lockerbie bombing, several others, a nightclub bombing in Britain. And there was evidence linking Gaddafi's government to these crimes. At the same time, he was building weapons of mass destruction. Reagan launched a bombing raid against him in Libya. There were warnings to him to cut it out. And over time, Gaddafi moved back from that. He recognized that there was a better way to fight the colonialism which he opposed. And so in 2003, he ended his weapons of mass destruction program. And in 2006, the United States dropped the designation of Libya as a state sponsor of terrorism. Now, what was Gaddafi's program during that period of time? Well, he'd always been anti-colonial. He'd always spoken out for Pan-African unity. But in particular, he had developed a strategy which included using the oil revenue of Libya to build his nation with a very extensive program of infrastructure development, roads, healthcare, education. But beyond that, he said, look, we should use what we're developing for the whole of Africa. Why should the African continent, which is rich in resources and people, be a plundering ground, a looting ground for Western powers, for corporate cartels? And so Gaddafi began to put forward an idea not just of political Pan-African unity, but of economic unity, which coincided with the idea developing in Africa of a need to break once and for all with the neo-colonialism of the time. He was a little bit ahead of that, but the results in Libya were encouraging to others. And so the West decided it had to stop this. So you had the launching of demonstrations in February 2011 against Gaddafi. Now, his government quickly recognized that these were Islamist rebels who were funded by Western countries and backed by Western countries. As soon as these demonstrations started, in February, Sarkozy, the French president, came out and said, Gaddafi must go. And the French and the British followed a call by British Prime Minister Cameron for a no-fly zone. That is, to use NATO's aircraft to knock any Libyan planes out of the air. And this was begun in, I think, March or February or March. There was a French aircraft were the initial ones involved. Then the Royal Canadian aircraft came in. The British Royal Navy was involved in a blockade of Libyan ports. And then shortly after that, in the beginning of March, the Obama administration stepped forward with its plan to bring down the Gaddafi regime. There were more than 7,000 bombing sorties conducted by the British, French, Canadians, and the Americans. At the same time, arms and money were going into the rebels. When Obama was forced to explain what he was doing, he went to the U.S. Congress by saying that under the War Powers Resolution, he's entitled to engage in U.S. military action without going to Congress. The War Powers Resolution was a 1973 congressional act giving the president the right to engage U.S. forces without congressional approval. And of course, from that time on, the Libyan military was battered by these forces. Eventually, the rebels came to power in Tripoli. And then on October 20th, 2011, Gaddafi was hunted down and murdered in the most brutal fashion by the rebels supported by the West. And there was the famous scene of Hillary Clinton, who was a leading supporter of this operation, who told a news reporter as she cackled We came, we saw, he died. This is the ugly face of American neo-colonialism. And this is what has led to a reaction which was triggered recently again by the NATO attacks on Russia and Ukraine. The idea that the Western rules-based order can be enforced by military thuggery, by assassination, by civil unrest. The playbook for the color revolution is often cited by people who are opposed to this. Now, here's the question. 20,000 people may have died because of the destruction of the Libyan state by the West. Is anyone being held accountable to this? Does the BBC or Western journalists, do none of them know that this is the consequence, these deaths are the consequence of a destruction of a government which was committed to the well-being of its population? That's why the BRICS movement is so important, because countries in the so-called developing sector are taking matters into their own hands, saying they can no longer trust Western governments. And the West is sitting there saying, oh, this is something out of our control, and meanwhile Russia and China are bad because they're developing infrastructure. They're competing with us in Africa. They're not competing with the West. The West is doing nothing but continuing the plundering and stealing. The Chinese, the Russians, the Indians, and others are talking about actually developing Africa. And one of the models for that is what Gaddafi was proposing with an African monetary fund backed by gold and production, not by the petrodollar. So this is the change that's taking place in the world. Now, tomorrow I'm going to take your questions. It's Friday, so you can send me your questions or comments to harleysch@gmail.com. But I'll also include a report on what Vladimir Putin had to say at the Eastern Economic Forum in Vladivostok. I think you'll find very interesting.